Good morning, Redeemer. My name is Emily Seidel, and I'm on staff here with our college ministry at Redeemer. So if you're a college student and we haven't met yet, I would love the chance to get to meet you this morning. I'll be at the Connect table after the service. I'll also be reading our scripture for this morning, which comes from Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 and through 38. And if you don't have your Bible this morning, that's totally fine. We've got it available on the screens beside me. So Matthew chapter 9 says, "And Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, 'The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest.'"
All right, well, good morning, everybody. My name's Dusty. I'm one of the pastors, and I love the fall. Okay, football, yes, but even with we have a lot of you that are our members and regular attendees that are like back here, and I think you're even probably looking forward to the kind of the set rhythms of the fall. But then lots of new people this time of the year, which is also a blast. Families, singles, students, all of it. So I'm really glad you're here. What we're doing is we're doing a short series just talking about how Jesus engages people that are struggling, and people dealing with shame, being overwhelmed, maybe even being self-righteous. Like, how does Jesus engage us? And so let me just give you a brief overview of the series, and then we're going to introduce the topic today. So the overview of the series is that Jesus is just surprising in what he does, and we tend to import our perspective of what we think Jesus would be like onto Jesus, but I think it's really helpful to actually look at the Bible and see what Jesus is like from the scripture. And because we tend to, whatever our values are, we tend to just assume, or maybe our upbringing, we tend to assume positively or negatively what Jesus would be like. So for some of us, it could be that we think that Jesus is, screaming at us all the time, maybe like this cranky teacher or coach that just constantly put out, toughen it up and do better and come on, pick it up, whatever, that kind of thing. And just scolding students, hardly any positive affirmation. Some of us may imagine Jesus like that, or the flip side of it, and there's a million variations of this, or some of us may imagine Jesus to be this very affirming figure that's kind of detached, almost like aloof, but just kind of from a distance, kind of gives you the thumbs up on whatever it is that you already want to do, and that whatever you want to do is fine, and he's just here to affirm and make you kind of feel good about you and all of that. And so, if you come into the Bible just with an assumption of what Jesus is like, it can be shocking because he could just be different than what you thought. And so that's in general what we're going to be talking about. It's this surprising Jesus, the heart of Jesus while he interacts with sinners and sufferers. But today specifically, the topic we're going to be looking at is how Jesus engages those that are possibly lonely and those that are overwhelmed. And what does Jesus do with people like that? And maybe even make it more personal. So I'm going to walk through, like on a personal level, how I can be overwhelmed, how that plays out for me. So for me, what Amy and I'm saying this has been true as far back as I could possibly think of it. I can excuse it and say, well, got kids and things are busy with church and all this. But my wife has a lot of leadership responsibilities at her work. I do as well. Our kids are very active with sports and school and everything else, all that kind of stuff, mostly sports. So there's all those things going on. And then we could just, on the regular, like our schedule, like I'm looking at our next 2 months specifically. Like if I just zoom this into right now in my life, that I'm looking at my schedule and I kind of transfer everything from the calendar, a little Evernote thing, and put it in text. And I'm like, oh boy. I don't know how we're going to make this through, And so sometimes schedule-wise, like our life kind of sort of works if nothing crazy happens. Like if nothing unexpected happens, you can kind of look and maybe it'll kind of hold together. And so sometimes I can even look at our schedule and be like, man, like that's a lot. And it's a recurring theme. One time I was complaining about this in my very first youth ministry. So this kid would now be like 43 now, raising a family, right? But I was talking with him going, how are things going? Oh man, it's crazy right now. And he's like, Dusty, back when you were going to seminary single, working 20 hours a week, you're out of control busy. So I think his point was that this has been a long-standing pattern for me. So sometimes I can feel really overwhelmed with schedule and making all the pieces fit, and like you're just kind of putting out one fire in front of the other and kind of trying to make it to the next day. But then on top of that, sometimes I can be overwhelmed when I feel hopeless that, man, is this thing here ever going to change? I don't know. I'm just not sure it is. And not to mention even self-inflicted things that whenever I sin against God and do things that are clearly laid out in the Bible to do or to not do, and then sometimes I don't do those things. And I'm sure I'm the only one in here like that. But that those things too can just be overwhelming. Going, man, I know these things need to change, but do I have the courage to face that head on? And would I trust God with this? Do I really think that He has good for me? And all of this and more, and not to mention even just other things that people are going through, and maybe even that you observe in the world that are heartbreaking, and it could just feel overwhelming in a lot of different ways. And so the question would be, is like, what does God do for someone like me that can feel overwhelmed with all that? And then not to mention, like, there's all sorts of other things too, and we'll talk about that, like, that you might be dealing with. And then I'll add one extra layer on this. On top of that, there are going to be some of you that are here today, and I'm really glad you're here, that are exploring like what it would mean to follow Jesus. Like or maybe you're not even exploring. You lost a bet. You, for whatever reason, bet on a preseason football game this week, and you lost. You had to come. Who knows? And for you, you're even wondering, like you're trying to figure out like what's even real and true about God, what's real and true about this life, what's real and true about, is there another life after this? And it's also confusing, and a lot of the main messages you can even hear in our world are like, well, don't worry about that. You just need to be you and be the most authentic version of yourself that you can be, and you need to discover that and then be true to that. And that sounds incredible until you start trying to do it. And you're like, well, how would I know? How do I know what's authentically me and not just a cultural reflection of people around me? And even trying to be authentically me, what happens if that's a cultural reflection of the moment I live in? And do I need to go to the desert and go to a monastery to figure this out? Like, how would I discover what the authentic, it can actually put a lot of pressure. And then what happens whenever you aren't true to yourself with whatever you discover? And so what does Jesus do for people that are even spiritually confused, that don't even know which end is up, what's real, what's true? Is he going to be put out? Is he going to look the other way indifferently? Is he going to scream at you? Like, what in general is Jesus going to do with people that are overwhelmed and confused? So let's turn to the Bible, because that's probably the best thing we can do, I would think, to clarify what does Jesus do with overwhelmed people. Matthew 9, this is what Emily read just a moment ago, and I'm going to pick up in verse 35. And Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. So Jesus is going through. Now, he can only be at one place at one time during his earthly ministry whenever Jesus was walking around. And so he did not just heal every single disease and teach. There wasn't like a loudspeaker or a podcast or something like that reached every single person in all of Israel and, in fact, all the world. But he would physically go through one village, and it was saying that while he would go, he would teach. So that already gives us some clues about what Jesus is going to do. Is he's not just going to leave us on our own to figure out what's real and true and beautiful and what should be avoided and what we should live for and what's the big picture. Is that he taught on it, and he explained the gospel of the kingdom, and he explained the values of the kingdom. If you were here this summer, we did all summer long in the Sermon on the Mount, and that would have been the kind of thing that he would have been communicating. Is here are the values of God. Here's Jesus's moral vision for how things ought to be lived. But then all of these things would have been leading up to the cross and the resurrection. And as the gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John carry on, more and more Jesus begins to point there that this is the ultimate destination of where everything is headed. So he'd been communicating these kinds of things and telling them their only hope could be found in trusting the Father, and that ultimately that Jesus would be going to the cross and the resurrection. And so that would have been the kind of thing he had been teaching. And then furthermore, it says that he was healing every disease and affliction. Now, God doesn't always heal, but in this case, Jesus was walking around and he was looking at people in the eyes. And I think this is significant that there weren't a line of people. And I want you to think about like how much buzz there would have been, that these are relatively small communities as he was going from community to community. Can you imagine if Jesus shows up in Muleshoe or Post or wherever. He's making a little West Texas tour, and he goes through Muleshoe and down to Anton and on and on, whatever, Littlefield, and he's going to stop through there. And can you imagine is that there's this woman with stage 4 cancer, and like it's just healed on the spot. And right next to this person, you've got a young guy that struggles with anxiety, with depression, and on the spot it's healed, and on and on. Someone that hadn't been able to sleep fixes it. Someone else that had a heart condition fixed, and on and on. Like, can you imagine the buzz that would be created in Muleshoe? I mean, how long would it take in a town like that to get to the old guys at Dairy Queen that are sitting there? I don't even know if there's a Dairy Queen in Muleshoe, but they're complaining about the weather and the lack of rain, and they're like, hey, did you hear about? I mean, it wouldn't take any time at all. That there would have been all over the place. There would have been incredible demand. But what's interesting is that he's looking people in the eyes, and he's not looking past them. Number 42. Next, what do we got? Almost like you go to the DMV or something like that. No offense, DMV employees that are here. Next, they're not even looking at you in the eyes. You need to go wait in line now. You'll be number 42. That rather, like he's looking at people in the eyes and seeing what's going on with them, and he's entering into where they are. Now, he doesn't, again, always heal, but in this case, this is exactly what he was doing, looking at people in the eyes and seeing them and healing them. And I think that's just really incredible. Now, this next verse, to me, is the zinger and this whole conversation. Verse 36 says, when he saw the crowds, so he's looking at people and looking them in the eyes, seeing what they're dealing with, and he says he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And, looking around, there's a lot of different things you could do when you see a crowd of people that are struggling with a lot of things in life. And you could look around the crowd and see like the angry people, like the ones that are always mad. Like they almost permanently have like a scowl on their face. And, no matter what happens, you win the national title this year. You start talking to them, man, wasn't that incredible? Well, I didn't like the play calling, but sure, if you like to throw that much, or whatever, that wouldn't really matter. They could do anything. Oh, it's incredible. You won the lottery. Yeah, but the taxes, whatever. But he would look at that kind of person, and he would actually, there'd be compassion, and he would understand the backstory of someone that would be there, and how, like, he understands all of the things in the family they grew up with, some of their experiences that would lead them to have that permanent scowl on their face. And you have someone, you might have a really powerful business person, this guy that's there in whatever the equivalent of a suit and looking sharp and all that. In fact, kind of in a hurry, and you're going to speed this up. Can you kind of give me the cliffs on this and whatever? And like he would understand that person, and right next to that person, there's a young woman with anxiety, and he would understand that, and he would see this crowd. And there are a lot of different things you can have. You would have a variety of political representation in that kind of crowd. And there were these kind of political parties, very different takes on what to do with Rome in Israel at the time. There were some that were these zealots that wanted to separate and basically wanted revolution. And you had a whole other group of people that were like, no, this is actually, we could work with this. This actually might be really good. And you had a variety of perspectives in there. And you saw all these people, and his response wasn't disgust. It also wasn't condoning. It wasn't necessarily agreement, but it was compassion. And I think it's interesting, and I think we need to specify what we mean by compassion, because for some of us, again, we tend to import, this is why Jesus is so surprising, we tend to import our own perspective culturally and even maybe based on our experiences onto Jesus about what it is that he was like. And some of us might think what compassion meant is that, again, Jesus is kind of that aloof, distant figure with a thumbs up, saying, well, whatever, if that's you, if that's authentically you, then, and if you think that makes you happy, then I'm for that. I don't think we should infer that compassion would mean something like endorsement of our choices. And part of the reason, even though this passage doesn't communicate that in full, this is just telling us that he's compassion. I don't think you should read in that compassion means endorsement with our specific choices, mostly just because we can look at the rest of the kind of things that Jesus talked about. And we'll even see some of this next week whenever we talk about Jesus encountering shame, or the following week when we talk about Jesus encountering self-righteousness, that sometimes Jesus will talk talk, like there'll be tough and hard talk in the middle of things, where he'll say, hey, that thing right there needs to change, and that right there isn't helpful, and this isn't good right here, and that is not a path to life, and we need to go in a different direction here. Like, this is dishonoring to God, but furthermore damaging to you. And so you shouldn't read that compassion always means endorsement. That in fact, there may be tough talk and like real talk that comes along with compassion. So compassion is not endorsement. It's also not pity, where Jesus looks at you almost in a dismissive way and kind of looks at you and says, poor thing, that kind of condescending, poor thing, I'm not going to lift a finger to help you, but that kind of thing. And so it's not that. It's also not, yelling at you. And I felt like my whole senior year of high school, I was led around, in between play series when I played on defense, I was led around by my face mask. And so it's also not God leading you around by your face mask, telling you to pick it up and you got to do better and you got to improve this and improve that. So that's obviously not compassion either. So what it is that there was love, there was concern. And whenever he sees these people that had made a mess in their life and they were anxious and were very powerful and were confused about things and didn't know what end was up spiritually, they'd heard lots of things, but it was hard to know what to trust, and were struggling with things and had made bad choices, and even some self-inflicted pain they'd brought on. And even life had been very tough on them. There'd been loss that they couldn't have avoided. They didn't cause. That he saw all of this, and his first response was compassion. And I think that's telling. It's hard to believe in a lot of ways whenever you really consider it. And it even tells us because of why. In compassion, it says because they were harassed and helpless. And life has a way of harassing us. And you can sense, you're like, no, I'm not helpless, man. It says in the Bible that God helps those who help themselves. And you're like, well, does it? First of all. But then secondly, that we realize real quick with all that tough talk about, hey, I got this, I got it sorted, that you start getting into life and you realize that life will kick you around. And there's all kinds of things that you can't control. You can't control other people's choices. You can't control things that are going on in the world, the economy. There's all kinds of things. A loss of life, 100% death rate, last time I checked in the world. And there's all kinds of things that go on that you can feel that. And we're at a certain level, there's some things we can control that we're responsible for, but there's these other things that we're harassed and we're helpless. And then he even pulls it all together with a bit of a metaphor that Jesus does a lot. And he says, like sheep without a shepherd. And we can be tempted here to go, oh, that's neat, that he thinks we're cute like that, that we're cute little. My mom loves sheep and there's like little paintings and little, Christian wall art and all these kind of things of sheep and Jesus cuddling with them. And sure, he loves sheep. We do know that, but it's actually not that much of a compliment when it really comes down to it. Not real smart, don't really know what to happen. We have no natural defenses whatsoever. We really are helpless, harassed. And what he's saying is that he looks that we're as helpless as we are, that we don't know it. And we're like, no, but I'm going to hoof them. And I've got these teeth and all this stuff. And you're like, no, that's not going to work at all against a wolf, and not even a little bit. And so he sees this, and his first emotion in response to that is not eye roll and, oh my gosh, I've already explained it to him. Have you not read my book? Bestseller, and have you not, I've given sermons on this, and here we are, and you still can't, that's not what he does. And not even, how can you think that, and how can you do that? And if you'd have done what I said, you wouldn't have been in this position, none of that, but it was compassion. And the ultimate expression of this, if you just were to flip forward in this book, would be Jesus' death. That he, whenever he saw our spiritual condition, that we're helpless and harassed, and we don't know when it is up, and there's so many competing truth claims, and we don't know what to do, and we've got this weird stain on our soul that does like really dark and ugly things, all of us. The Bible calls this sin, that again, instead of saying, clean it up, figure it out, pick it up, that his answer is he lays down his life for you. He sees that you're sheep without a shepherd, and he dies, and he comes back to life. And so, he saw this, and there was compassion. That compassion actually fueled Jesus going all the way to the cross on your behalf to reconcile you with God. all right? So I think there's lots of reasons to not be self-righteous, but this might be one of the things that deals with the I'm better than you attitude than anything. If we know the one that actually is the founder of our religion, you could say, God in the flesh that comes to the earth, the one that we hinge everything on, to know that his first response isn't gross, yuck, but rather compassion all the way to the point of emptying himself to death on the cross and a resurrection, that it might be the thing that dials back self-righteousness, which we'll cover in a couple of weeks more than anything. So let me just even interact with this for a minute personally. So earlier I told you some of the ways that I can feel overwhelmed, and maybe yours are similar, or maybe they're different. I don't know. I think there are a lot of you that are probably pretty busy this fall, but I can feel overwhelmed because of schedule and because of things going on, and even my own sin and brokenness in the world, even brokenness almost like a first responder that I drive up on sometimes emotionally and spiritually of things that people are going through. And the voice that's in my head the most, probably one of two things, is how I can imagine Jesus interacting with me, like maybe after a period of struggle spiritually or bad decisions or the schedule, anything like that, is I can imagine Jesus grabbing me by the face mask and saying, hey, let's figure this out, something along those lines. Figure it out. Get back in there, make a play, that kind of thing. And I don't got time for this. And we've talked about this before, and run me back out there. I imagine that voice sometime before where it's far from compassion. It's kind of scolding. Don't got time for this. I also imagine another one where it's just almost like, and because I have this, and maybe this is because I have this response in me a lot, is that it's like he didn't want to look at me, almost back turned, where I've told you what to do, and I'm not even addressing this because I know you're not sorry. And you say that you're going to not get yourself in the schedule. You did it to yourself, buddy. So here we are. Almost where you find his back more than his face, his compassion. It's how I can imagine Jesus. Now, the good news is that we're not left with our imagination of what Jesus would be like, but we actually see in print here what Jesus is like, and that's that he has compassion on us for what we're going through. And he doesn't show us our face. He doesn't show us his back. He doesn't grab us around by our proverbial face mask and yell at us to go figure it out, to do better next time, to clean it up, to handle it. It doesn't also not pity, poor thing, but care and concern, and that the cross is a demonstration of this. And we have actually in print what Jesus is like whenever we struggle and wherever we feel overwhelmed. Also, imagine like a totally different kind of person. So I'm going to give you a couple hypotheticals. So imagine you got a freshman that shows up this week at Tech, LCU, and maybe grew up in church and, talked to their youth leader, and they're like, hey, Tech has a reputation of party school. What are we going to do here? And they're like, what? I haven't heard, that kind of thing. And then they're like, no, man, I'm going to be all about it, church and all sorts of stuff. But anyways, you show up to the campus and didn't really know a lot of people, and, a bunch of people in your residence hall end up going out and go out and have a good time. And, one drink turns into a lot of drinks, and one night turns into a few nights right as you start off into the fall. And then here you are this Sunday, and you're like, man, maybe, your parents asked you to go and do a check-in, maybe an Instagram post or who knows what. And so here you are, and then now this conversation's happening, and you're like, oh man, this is not how I intended to start this, Now, if you're dropping a kid off today, I'm sure this is not the case with your kid, but other kids, it might be true. And so, like, now what does Jesus do though? Like, this was a path. And so again, the temptation here would be to say that, oh, he has compassion, so it's no big deal. Well, no, because here's the thing. I saw this analogy a while back that sometimes we think we want freedom, but you're a fish, and freedom is going to be found in that water. You can move around that river wherever you want, move around that lake wherever you want, and there's going to be thriving. There's bugs to eat, and there's minnows. There's all kinds of things, and safety from predators. But sometimes we're like, no, man, I got to be free from this, and I'm going to get up on the bank of the river, and I'm going to get up on the shore, and that's where I'll really thrive. And here's the thing: Jesus' compassion is going to include, because you'll see him do this a lot in the New Testament, where he'll say, hey, that right there though is going to kill you. So the freedom is going to be in the river. So you might find Jesus saying, hey, look, this right here is going to damage you. Like he's going to have real talk with you about your choices. And that whole scene right there is a dead end. It's going to go nowhere for you. There's much pain and regret here. And so he's going to steer you in another direction. Would you just trust me? There's emptiness here. There's shallowness here. This isn't for you. You've even sensed some of that emptiness now. So he's going to say, let's get back in the river. But there's also, even in those words, there's compassion. But there's also forgiveness and not running you around with your face mask, not turning his back to you, but looking at you in your eyes, having this conversation with you, forgiving you because of his death and resurrection, but also telling you where life is found. Compassion sometimes is going to include both that truth as well as the grace, which we're going to see next week in John 4. So you can imagine this freshman that we're to encounter that maybe hadn't had the kind of start like they wanted to, that would encounter God's grace. Or imagine an exhausted mom that's got between work and has got kids that are, there's a new one in there now, and now the middle kid now isn't sleeping like they used to. It seems like every single night somebody's in bed with you that you weren't expecting, and all kinds of things are happening. Even the marriage doesn't feel as fresh and connected as it did in the past, and you're struggling, and you just kind of wonder, like you're sleepy, you're tired, you just feel even less connected with some of your friends, even your church. Like, what's Jesus do here? And again, the answer is not, hey, toughen up. What did you think? You had babies, so, that kind of thing. So what would happen if instead that God were to say, look, I see you, and that's hard. What happens if instead what you would most likely get is a hug and encouragement and a reminder that his presence is with you while you're changing diapers and while you're chasing kids around at games, and even if that marriage isn't maybe as deep and as connected as it has time, maybe as intimate as it has in the times past, that he's still with you and his care is there for you, and it's a season, and he will walk with you through this season, and there will be strengthening and there will be encouragement in the middle of feeling overwhelmed with this particular life moment, or you're studying for a block of tests in med school, and hey, you're going to get through this. I'm with you. I see you. I know you're lonely. I know you're going hard right now, but it's going to be okay. I'm with you. That there's compassion. There's compassion. So I want to just conclude, though, with a shocking turn to this passage that is really surprising. So I hope you feel this, that wherever you are, you're like, I don't know if anybody understands. There's one who does. There's one at least. There's one who understands and who will tell you the truth about where you're at, who will turn you towards him, turn you towards a path back in the water where you can thrive, where you can find freedom. And there's one who will do that, one who understands and cares, gets you everything else. So, but here's a shocking turn to this passage, verse 37. So he's already talking about these overwhelmed people. And this is, then he said to his disciples. So he's kind of like debriefing this experience here. And it says, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. So it's like, now we're talking like evangelism and missions, and meeting needs in our community and the world, all right? It's like, well, hold on a second. I thought we were talking about Jesus being compassionate for what I'm going through, for being overwhelmed, and for being confused. And now we're talking about making sure everybody knows about Jesus. So like, what gives here? And I've never noticed this before, because I've taught the passage we just did before, and then I've taught these couple of verses here about that sin. We're asking and praying for God to send out laborers both into Lubbock, but even to the ends of the earth among people groups that have never heard the name of Jesus. That we want to see both of these things happen. But it's interesting. I think that the transition between these two things is notable, and I think one of the things that's interesting is that it's actually flowing. If you think about it, what we're learning in these previous verses is that Jesus is compassionate about the world. That whenever he looks at people, he doesn't think, gross. And honestly, I think Christians are sadly not known for this, that I think there's way too much of this in all of our hearts, where you look at someone maybe with a different political ideology than you, and you're like that. That's almost like there's no words for it. Or maybe people that have different moral stances than you on key issues, key things, lifestyle differences, and you're like, and like a lot of times our first response, and people are doing things, you're like, well, they should have known better. And whatever the case is, we look at people, look at that mean person with a scowl on their face and be like, I don't want anything to do with someone like that. I don't want anything to do with that. I would never be like that. I would never. Or look at someone who's lazy and be like, well, go work and you wouldn't be in this position, on and on. And we look at this like dismissive, judgmental, like the zero compassion in our soul. And I think that what Jesus is doing here is saying, hey, all right, so on the one hand, you've got your own needs and your own brokenness, and you're actually in solidarity with the rest of humanity, Christian or not, on this. And Jesus has compassion for you, so much so that he laid his life down on the cross. But then we look around to our world and we see that our world is the same way, hopeless, confused, even while they're trying to be them. That's a lot of pressure. How do you even know when you're doing that? And they're confused. They're making bad decisions. Life is knocking them around. They're helpless. They're harassed. And what would happen if God were to raise all of us up to be armed with the compassion of Jesus, sent out into the world, being the hands and feet of Jesus, that our first impulse, like Jesus, would not be gross, disgusting, all this. It doesn't mean that those choices were good or their stances are right. Again, it doesn't mean condoning or agreeing with whatever people think. But what would happen instead if we were armed with the compassion of Jesus? That whenever we look at someone and we're out in the world, and you may never have had an affair, and you may never have been through that. You may never have walked through addiction. You maybe have never walked down that moral path. You maybe grew up in the church and never really had a period of leaving the faith or something like that, but you see someone with questions and doubts. You may not have experienced that exact thing. However, you've experienced other things, and Jesus showed compassion to you. What would happen if we were armed with the compassion of Jesus to bring both truth and grace into our world? What would happen? And then we're God's sent ones into the world, sent out, and we're even praying that we're now, and this is one of Redeemer's values of being a gospel-centered missional family. It's not, hey, come to church and the preacher will tell you about Jesus, but rather all of us together are sent out onto our campuses, our workplaces, our neighborhoods, our youth sports teams, intramural teams, whatever. We're all sent out into our city to make Jesus known. And what happens if, after experiencing the compassion of Jesus, that it comes with truth, that we bring that compassion to our world, and that he sees you while you're overwhelmed, but now he sends you to an overwhelmed world. Isn't that something? It's like, no, I need to have my stuff together first. No, that doesn't never happen, but rather you're sent. So what we're going to do is I'm going to lead us through a prayer, and it'll be on the screen here, and you're going to personalize it. And this is adapted from a friend of mine named Elliot, and it's been really helpful for me. So I'm going to read this prayer over you, all right? But I want you to think about what you're overwhelmed about right now. Like, what's the thing you're overwhelmed about? Is it how I'm going to survive the next 2 months? Is it I've got this crippling area of sin that I can't seem to make any headway against? Is it I'm filled with grief because I'm dropping my kid off and I'm not sure what my life looks like going forward? Is it this depression? Is it the infertility? Is it anxiety about my profession and its future? I don't know. But you think about that. I'll give you just a second. I bet you already got it, don't you? You probably didn't have to think real hard. You've been thinking about it this whole sermon. So I'm gonna pray this, and I want you in your heart silently on that blank, you're going to insert that there. So agree with me and pray this to God right now. God, I feel overwhelmed because I have limits. I've reached my limits, Lord. I'm weak. I am not you. I am not all powerful. You are powerful. You never get overwhelmed. I am not alone in this. Jesus, you're with me. Now, because of this, Lord, send me out, raise up others, Lord, as well. Lord, would you do this? Work a deep work. Thank you that you show compassion that isn't enabling, but it's also freeing. Lord, would you do this? And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.